So you can see, for example, that crimson clover is producing a lot more forage a lot earlier on. So that's the reason why I think it's one that fits extremely well. You know, at the end of the day, there's others that are going to produce more total forage than the crimson clover, but it does have a really good fit. Now, I've also added into this a measure of variability, and I didn't want to, overwhelm you with numbers, so I just used something very, very simple. The more V's that you see, the more variable it is from year to year. So some of these species, especially for the early season production, are going to be either feast or famine species. You're either going to have good production early in that season or you're not going to have it. And especially berseem and subclover, both of those generally are either a boom or a bust. But crimson clover, relatively low variability from year to year, and certainly for the season total, it's very consistent as to what it produces year in and year out, about a ton and a half of forage per acre. Same sort of thing for the coastal plain. For those that may be interested in the coastal plain, you can see some of the early season production. In this case, I've also broken it down into mid-season production and then very late season production, and then totaled all of that up. And then on the next slide, I actually looked at that in terms of variability in each of those sections as well. Now, in that case, I've also thrown in some of the perennials like red and white clover. In the coastal plain region, typically those are going to be essentially used as annuals anyway. They don't last more than about a year in most cases in the southern part of the state. Now let me switch gears and talk a little bit about cool season annuals. We talked about warm season annuals, we've talked about cool season perennials. Let me talk a little bit about our cool season annual grasses. And I'm going to fly through these. I apologize for going through them so rapidly, but you've got this material in front of you. And I basically want to emphasize with oat. Oat is one of those that's not really applicable here in the Piedmont. You can grow it a little bit, but it's probably not your best choice. There are others that are going to work a little bit better. For example, rye is one that could work fairly well. Cereal rye is extremely tolerant of soil acidity. Much more tolerant than many of our other cool season annuals. It's very tolerant of cold conditions, but the problem with it is that it matures extremely quickly. It will go from nice and vegetated mass to a great big old seed head practically overnight, at least within a week. If the weather changes, it just jumps. And so you have to really be managing the grazing on that, or be willing to go out there and mow it back or something like that to keep it getting away from it. Now, wheat is one of those that, in my opinion, is not as valuable of a grazing crop for us unless it's being used for both grazing and then grain production later. That's when wheat can be helpful as a dual crop. But as a general rule, it's not as valuable. So as a consequence, I'm going to speed through that and talk more about annual ryegrass. Because in my opinion, annual ryegrass is the Cadillac of winter annual species. It's the highest quality winter annual that we grow. We call it rocket fuel. And there's a very good reason we call it that, because it is extremely energy dense and it does produce a lot of good grazing. Now, it does need to have a soil pH preferably above 6.0. It typically is a little later maturing. It's not going to really produce a lot of forage until late April, May, and maybe even into June. Okay? But it is fairly cold tolerant, but there are other problems with it as well, and some that we need to be aware of if we're overseeding, for example, our Bermuda grass pastures or Bermuda grass hayfields, is that it does interfere with Bermuda grass. It's really productive at the time of the year where Bermuda grass is coming out of dormancy, so it competes very hard with the Bermuda grass. Here's some varieties, and all of this material, again, is in your handout as well as on the web. Now, I thought I'd just kind of end this section here talking a little bit about how these different species compare to one another in terms of crude protein and TDN. We've already introduced those subjects as being the most important aspects of quality to look at on a comparison basis. But you can see the high end of the range, which typically you're going to be dealing with animals that are grazing, particularly those that are very selective in how they graze. So, you know, we can see some extremely high levels of energy here. TDN values that are extremely high. And you can kind of see how much performance we're going to get out of those individual species, how much yield we're going to get out of them. Excuse me just a minute. Okay, let me spend some time now talking about some of the novel forages. What I mean by novel are some of those that we typically don't use in other forage systems, but work really well, particularly in goat systems. The first one that I want to spend some time talking about are some of the novel winter annual species. Now, these are what we call brassicas. Brassicas are a large term for the turnips, rape species, or you might know it as canola, okay? And other types. Swedes, for example, are one that they commonly use in other countries. And then there are hybrids of those that are bred for more of a forage production. Now, this is a good example of some forage turnips. This is from Madison County, I believe is where this was taken. This is actually a beef cattle pasture, but the same could be said for using this in goat pastures. They do a good job of grazing back the tops, and you can see some frost damage done to the tops now that it's late into the season. But you can also see that they've begun to chew on the actual turnips themselves. So it's a really good source of stored carbohydrates there for those animals. And it is fairly productive in the fall of the year, which again is one of those holes that we have in our forage production systems. So looking at, for example, November production, here's a variety trial from Mississippi State University. And you can see some of these varieties do very, very well in the fall of the year. In fact, a purple top turnip, which is not really a forage turnip, but I mean, we use it for forage. Purple top turnip actually produces a lot of forage there in the first part of the season. So it can be a nice little fit for us, as well as give us a lot of forage over the entire season. Those are big numbers, especially if you go back looking at what we were getting out of annual ryegrass, which is our best winter annual. Now, another one that I want to spend some time talking about is chicory. And chicory is what we call a forb. A forb that typically in our area, at least in North Georgia, is going to last up to 5 years. Maybe a little longer than that, but generally 3 to 5 years is how long we're going to get it to last. What I would suggest with chicory, though, is that if we get down below the fall line and get into the coastal plain, this is not something that's going to produce extremely well for us. As a general rule, though, we only recommend, using that in 2 to 3 year cycles. Right? I'm expecting it to only last 2 to 3 years, but in our studies, we've been able to get some pretty good life out of them, especially in mixtures with other grass species. They are very, very small seeded. The seeding rate is 3 to 4 pounds to the acre. So you have to mix this seed with something like sand or lime to be able to disperse it. But if you recall back to the original preference trial that I was talking about, chicory is one of those very highly rated and highly preferred. It also has very high quality associated with it, and even high in free protein. Even though it's not a legume, it's still relatively high in free protein. Now, this is one that definitely would prefer to be managed under rotational grazing, or that rational grazing approach that I've been talking about. And it also responds extremely well to nitrogen. You will have to put some nitrogen out there with this particular species to get it to be extremely productive. But it does produce some compounds that make it, especially if we're dealing with milk production, this can actually affect some and cause some off flavors in the milk. So just be aware if you are using the milk for anything, this could cause some changes. The recommended varieties for chicory are Puna and Commander, both of which are fairly widely available. Yes.
Can't you plant your clover with your chicory to get your nitrogen?
Yes, good point. Yes, you can absolutely put your chicory and clover together. A good match for that is actually red clover. Red clover has a similar lifespan, and it would match very well with the chicory.
Your Durana doesn't do as good.
Durana would work as well, but the red clover will actually give you a little bit more nitrogen, and it matches up with the grazing needs of chicory. So it needs to be rotationally grazed. Durana, you can hammer it a little harder, and it's still going to stick around a little bit. So you could use it, but in my recommendation, if you're rotationally grazing anyway, which you would need to if you got chicory, I would use red clover.
And you would just like overseed during a certain time of year?
Yeah, so what I would prefer to do in that is, for example, if I was putting chicory into some tall fescue, for example, I would come along in the January time frame or something like that and broadcast out some red clover, and then I would introduce the chicory as well. Drill it in preferably, or you could also broadcast it as well. But you would, if you were going to do that with the chicory, you would want to seed the chicory in the fall and seed the red clover in January, February. Okay. Now, another aspect to this is that we typically force those animals to graze fairly close to the ground. As you recall, I mentioned earlier on, they prefer grazing from the shoulder up. Now, one of the reasons that they prefer to do that is that the internal parasite load is very high when you start grazing close to the ground. The possibility of ingesting some of those internal parasites are very high if we're grazing very tightly. So what we really need to keep in mind is this whole aspect of the internal parasites. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to recognize the fact that our grazing system is not independent of this cycle with the barber pole worm, for example, here. So we definitely want to be keeping track of these animals in terms of how that they are performing and how infected that they are with these particular internal parasites. And I know about this system, and I don't want to spend any time on it because I know that you all are going to spend more time on this in other sections. But just be aware that this is a technique that you need to be using in combination with your grazing system. And one of those items that I would like to see or like to recommend to you to think about including in your grazing system is a legume called Sericea lespedeza. Sericea lespedeza is a long-term, long-lived perennial legume. It's tolerant of a lot of soil conditions. It's widespread adaptation throughout the entire state, and it has a long-lived lifespan. It's fairly productive. It's not going to set any yield records, but it is going to be something that's fairly productive in terms of yield. Tolerant of soil pHs, but it would prefer something to be a little bit better than about 5.8 or so. What's really nice is it doesn't have hardly any bloat potential at all as a legume. No bloat potential to speak of. We can relatively easily establish that with drilling or broadcast. However, it's not an extremely vigorous plant. So it may sit there for a few years before you really start seeing it really take off. Here are the varieties that are currently recommended, although for all intents and purposes, as far as I can figure out, only AU Grazer is one that is typically available. That's the one that's most widely available anyway. There may be some other varieties out that I'm not aware of. But what's nice about Sericea is that it has a high level of condensed tannins. That tannin content in many other livestock systems is actually makes it undesirable for those systems. But in small ruminants, Sericea lespedeza is a very valuable component because of that tannin level, because it actually has a deworming, a natural deworming characteristic to it. I'll talk more about that now that I'm talking about tannins. Anybody know where tannins got their name or why they were used? What's that? Tanning leather. Primary use over time has been used to tan leather. The reason being is this is a polyphenol that actually binds to proteins and other molecules as well, and it's used for tanning. That's what really gives it that distinct color of a tan hide.